I'm not going to introduce our panelists individually. You do have their introductions, but I am just going to go down the list by their names, and they are Ambassador Alan Johnson, who is the CEO of Allen F. Johnson and Associates. Jim Ferland, President for the Americas of Westinghouse, next to him. Ambassador Guillermo A. Cochez, who is the permanent representative of Panama to the Organization of American States. And finally, Robert Sicina, who is an executive in residence at the Kogod School of Business at American University and a former president of American Express Limited. So I'm going to ask each of them to speak for approximately 5 minutes on our topic, which is Latin America. And as I understand it, we have a very rigorous clock timekeeper here who will activate an executive trapdoor should they go over their time limit. So we'll try to keep things on schedule. I'll then give them an opportunity to interact with each other briefly, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. So with that, let me begin with Ambassador Johnson.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is a hard act to follow. That was actually a fascinating presentation by the Prime Minister that hit on a lot of the points that we're going to continue to talk about today. Some things are timeless. Trade and globalization seem to be one of them. One of the things I find fascinating is although we've seen really a stall when it comes to trade agreements, particularly with the United States and other countries, including Latin America. And we've seen a stall in the World Trade Organization negotiations. You haven't seen a stall in terms of growth in trade. If you look at any of the statistics, you've seen even despite the downturn in the economy, you continue to see trade grow. And that's no exception in this hemisphere. The other thing that you see, even though the U.S. is sort of standing on the sideline in these trade agreements, that the other countries are not. As you look throughout the region, you'll see that virtually every country of significance is engaged in some sort of trade negotiation with some other part of the world, whether they be Europe, Asia, or within themselves in the Americas. One of the problems that I have in talking about Latin America is it's very hard to generalize. You have within the region countries that are state-of-the-art, like Chile, that can really compete with anybody anywhere in the world, both as having institutions that are credible and companies. You have countries that don't even share the same economic system we do, like Cuba. You have countries that are heading in the direction of becoming more state-of-the-art, like Colombia. And you have countries that are heading in the opposite direction, like Venezuela. So generalizing is difficult. It's sort of like taking a 90-degree day in July and a 0-degree day in December and then saying the average temperature of the two is 45, I think I'll wear a heavy sweater. And you'll find you're not prepared for either one. Part of the challenge, I think, in dealing with Latin America is just that, is understanding where you're at. I often advise people to look at it from the point of view of that you're a tourist. Even if you think you know something about some place, you're better off finding someone that does know you and where you're from and does know the country you're going to before embarking on any sort of business venture. Because you can find yourself thinking that you're in an average Latin American country and find out that you're in a very different place. What's needed to succeed in these countries is basically understanding that you don't know anything until you go in there. I've been married to a Guatemalan for 25 years, been going to Central America for 30 years, negotiated the free trade agreement in Central America, and probably the smartest thing I did when I started to do business there was I went around and talked to people I knew and asked them what's it take to succeed here. And they gave me a very different perspective than I had visiting the ruins of Tikal or the beaches on the South Coast. It's a very different political and business environment that you have to work in. And just a few issues to consider when you're facing challenges in Latin America is whether or not you understand what the legal situation is, your ability to work in these environments and have enforceable agreements is a challenge at times, so the reputation of who you're dealing with is very important. Security is a very important issue that I'm sure will come up on everybody's radar screen as we're talking here today, and issues related to that the environment is not going to stay the same. As I was saying, most of these countries are engaged in very active trade agendas, in addition to the domestic political dynamics that are occurring in places, whether you're talking about Argentina or Peru or Venezuela or what have you. The environment changes, and how you react or don't at least overreact is going to be extremely important. I'll sort of finish. I don't see this high-tech sign going up yet, but with recognizing that when you're doing business in these places, you live by different rules oftentimes. The Foreign Corruption Practices Act is something that the United States has to deal with. It's often an issue. People say, geez, if it wasn't for that, I'm at a disadvantage. And my answer always back to them is, would you have it any other way? If you're thinking that you wouldn't want it any other way, then you're actually better off having an act that you can point at as an American company and say, I can't go there, than you are regretting that you can't go there. And if you would think about that you'd rather have it another way, then I would just read some of the Washington Post headlines recently about what the enforcement actions are against companies. They're up something like tenfold in the last few years. So it's a very serious challenge that American companies have. Other issues just to be thinking about, and I assume we're going to be talking about opportunities as we go on with this dialogue, is issues related to the integration within the region. Sometimes it's easier to get there from here, literally in the United States, than it is to work between two countries that are right next to each other in Latin America. Central America is a perfect example of that. Countries that are no further apart than Indiana and Ohio have trouble dealing with each other, and we can get into those markets more directly from here. And then just dealing with things like intellectual property, if you're dealing with intellectual property rights, or the lack of a modern corporate structure in many cases where you're dealing with multi-generational family companies. Sometimes that can make it difficult, but it also, if you develop a relationship, can give you unique opportunities. So my time is up, and we'll look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Jim?
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Very honored to be here this morning among such an esteemed audience and set of panelists. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a business perspective from some lessons learned, good and bad, that we at Westinghouse have experienced over the last few years. To start with, though, let me give you just a little bit of a perspective on the company so you can see the angle that we're coming from. Westinghouse is an energy company primarily focused on nuclear energy. So the last month or so for us, given the tragic events in Japan, has been a little bit different than what we had planned for. And it will have a dramatic impact on the world, actually, the energy industry, and Westinghouse in particular. So Westinghouse is an energy company, primarily nuclear, and about 10 or 15 years ago was essentially a U.S. company, a U.S.-based company that did business primarily in the United States, about $1.5 billion company. Today, Westinghouse is a $5 billion company, and the majority of our business comes from outside the United States, not inside the United States. So we've changed dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. In the opening 5 minutes, I was just going to hit on a couple of the highlights. As we've expanded both successfully and then we've had ventures that were not so successful globally, there are 3 or 4 tenets of the business that we've found to be generally true and generally helpful as we move into new parts of the world. That said, and I think everyone will say this today, each situation is unique, and each country we work with is different. And we found that we have to spend an awful long time both up front and then after we begin interaction, learning and adjusting as we go. But there are 3 or 4 things we found to be generally successful. So off the bat, and we say this all the time inside the company, we have global technology with local implementation. So we have common technology. We're essentially a technology company, both people and equipment. We have common technology and platforms that we apply around the world. but we apply them locally. So we leverage technology wherever we go, but we do it inside the country that we're working in. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a second. But global technology, local implementation. In order to be able to implement locally, we find we need to have a presence in the country that we'd like to work with. There are a variety of different ways to do that. What we have found successful over time is moving in up front and either finding a local partner, another company, that we can joint venture with, and oftentimes we actually go ahead and make that acquisition before we move into the country to give ourselves a local presence, an ability to implement locally, and also to develop a baseline level of understanding for how to do business in that locale. On the people side, typically at the beginning of an opportunity, we do take some of our expertise that's based either in the United States or in Europe, and we bring it into that country for a short period. Our goal is 3 to 4 years. So we take management talent, we permanently locate it in the country we'd like to work in for 3 to 4 years, and then we do an awful lot of local hiring. And as we begin to rotate that original management team back to the US or to Europe, we backfill that between 50 and 75% of the time with individuals that we've trained inside the company, inside the country, to backfill. So we truly have local implementation when we're done. And then lastly, at least in our business, on the nuclear side, government-to-government interaction and relationships are key. Right, some of that's obvious. Nuclear technology, we often can't move nuclear technology into another country without a bilateral treaty or certainly government-to-government cooperation. We also find that when we take a look at our customers, who are typically, most of our transactions are business to business, and they're relatively large transactions. We find that most of our customers are either a government directly, who has ownership of some sort of a utility, or they at least are very, very tied to their individual government. So for us, those are the four that we try to lay out. We try to establish a culture inside our company. We really build our company to emphasize global technology, local implementation, a focus on people, and try to be thoughtful about where we're going, how you do business, and make sure we understand or even try to enhance the government-to-government relationships as we move. So with that, I have yet to see a single sign, so I must be good. I will pass on my last minute or so, and we can move ahead.
Okay, we appreciate the extra time as well as the insights that you offered. Ambassador Cochez.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this particular invitation. It's been a great experience here in George mentioned University. As Ambassador Johnson mentioned, Latin America cannot be treated as a whole, like you see United States and Canada. No, Latin America have different ways to be seen. But today is the main business partner of the United States, and it will be much greater when this year the USA signs the free trade agreement with Colombia and Panama that will be announced in the following weeks. In the case of Latin America, according to the IMF, was one of the best regions economically growing during the international economic crisis. In the case of Panama, for example, our growth this year will be more than 10%. That means there is a lot of opportunities to American companies. I pointed 3 different challenges. First, as Prime Minister Mulroney mentioned, the Narco Cartels, because you cannot have a secure border, internal secure border, if you don't have external secure borders. We are suffering, and I mean all the Central American countries and Panama, of the policies of attacking the drugs in Mexico and in Colombia, because all those people from Mexico and Colombia are coming to our countries and are creating a big problem with the narco cartels. Also, the security, as Ambassador Johnson mentioned, the security, the rules, the judiciary system, the institution, we have to fortify more the institutions. You have a disadvantage, I mean the American companies have a disadvantage in our countries because you have corrupt policies, laws that doesn't apply to other countries like some European countries like China, Russia especially. There is an opportunity now to American investments because American businessmen are better known now than it was in the past. In the past, I mean, after the 60s, with the Cuban Revolution, etc., there was a growing anti-Americanism in our countries. Not anymore, especially since people understand that it's better to have an American investor than a China or a Russian one, because they treat us more like we are similar. We have problems in Latin America with countries, as was mentioned before, with Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and probably now Peru. Something that creates a lot of problems for American companies, European countries. For example, one of the last expropriated companies in Venezuela was Owen, Illinois, and that creates a lot of legal problems in arbitration cases in the World Bank, etc. And you go to Latin America not to find legal problems. You go there to make business. Also, I can point it as a problem that there is a little knowledge of our countries. Now it has been improving with the people in the U.S. missions in our countries. They speak more Spanish, they are more Latins, but there is something that you will have to understand, that we are not similar to the United States. We have to find ways to understand ourselves. We have to find ways to make business. We have in our organization, in the Organization of American States with headquarters in Washington, we have created a mechanism to fight corruption in all the countries, and it's supported very heavily by the United States and Canada. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, one of the countries evaluated was Canada. Evaluated by the government, but by the civil society too. Then we are creating those mechanisms of supervision for the corruption that is so heavy against investments in our country. But I think we have a lot of opportunity. We have a challenge to grow up, and we will have to do it with the Americans because we are in the same continent. We feel Americans, not because we are from North America, because we share the same continent, America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now let's move on to the last of our panelists, Robert Sicina.
Thank you, and of course it is a pleasure for me as well to be here. Before I begin, I would like to explain something that if in any of my remarks I say something that contradicts anything that Prime Minister Mulroney said, he is right, and either my facts are wrong or I didn't understand the issue. I'd like to begin by asking the audience a question. How many of you know that last year was the 200th anniversary of the start of Latin America's struggle for independence from Spain? Just a show of hands. Less than half. Okay. Don't feel terribly embarrassed about that. Obviously, Obama's advisors missed it too, otherwise they would have scheduled his visit a year earlier. Just as a political observation, I think since the Monroe Doctrine about 180 years ago, the policy of U.S. That was the moment in time when the U.S. put its arms around Latin America and basically said, you know, Europe, this is ours. or our turf. Its attitude towards much of Latin America over time has been one I would characterize as benign neglect. It sort of reminds me of the guy who loses his girlfriend because he takes her for granted. We've been more fortunate than that. In my remarks, I want to build my remarks around something Prince Machiavelli said, which was advice to get the bad news out all at once and let the good news out little by little. And I'll also build my remarks around some general comments, my perspective of the investment climate in Latin America, and then I'll make some comments about the specific economies sticking to the big four. So first, the bad news. If you're not already in Latin America, likely all your friends are. So your suppliers, your customers, and competitors are active investors. Latin America was, of course, discovered decades ago, and more broadly speaking, there are now some 20,000 multinationals operating in global emerging markets. Some more bad news, there are also many local competitors you will find are very strong and, in fact, are sophisticated multinationals themselves. But there's good news. Pioneers get shot at, and from the 70s through the turn of the century, lots of economic lumps were taken by investors. Being a nimble follower can be a very effective strategy, but the focus has to be on nimble. Latin America has promise, but it is demanding. You have to rethink your business model, by and large, from the ground up. Tweaking and local management aren't enough. Defeaturing your product to bring its price down is not likely to be enough. You have to rethink your fundamental value proposition from the perspective of your local customer. Check your assumptions at the door. Your greatest strengths in a developed market may be weaknesses in a developing market. And as has been said numerous times, in Latin America, every country is a country. It is, in my perspective, far less homogeneous than Asia. Now for a tour around the continent, again focusing on the four big hitters and sticking with the Prince's advice of first the bad news. Venezuela, in my perspective, is a total basket case with no discernible redeeming investment characteristics. With a totalitarian government posing as a democracy, GDP down 2 consecutive years in a row, 3.3% in 09, 2.8 in 10. My kind of fearless forecast, if you will, for Venezuela is that when the oil revenues become insufficient to fund populist demands, and it will, Chavez will be history. Argentina, a $600 billion economy with 7.5% growth in 2010. I tell you, that country is magical. This is the first year in 4 years that I didn't travel to Argentina, and I've been predicting its demise for every year for the last 4 years. It reminds me of Wile E. Coyote, who runs off, you may remember the cartoon character that runs off the edge of the cliff and gets about 15 feet over the edge before he realizes there's nothing underneath him. Cristina Kirchner continues to use the presidency to bully business in a desperate attempt to appeal to populism. It is, in my perspective, when I lived in Latin America for 14 years, I developed a kind of philosophy which was always bet your money on good management and not on resources, because bad management will fritter away all the resources in the world. Argentina, I think, is an example of that. And obviously, Venezuela is an extreme example of that. So now for some good news. I'm looking for my sign. Mexico, $1.6 trillion economy, 5% growth in 2010. Since NAFTA, which has been mentioned numerous times, its percentage of U.S. imports has risen from 7% to 12%. Canadian imports have doubled its percentage of Canadian imports. 90% of the country's trade occurs under free trade agreements with various countries around the world. It grew 5% in 2010 after a 6% contraction in 09. President Calderon has got a clear priority of creating jobs And if your proposed investment is export-oriented with free trade agreement countries, you're likely going to be able to negotiate very favorable terms. But then, as also has been mentioned, there is the shroud of drug trafficking. Now to Brazil. I lived in Brazil for 4 years, many years ago, when I was a child. We used to say that Brazil is the country of the future, and it will always be. Well, that's just not true anymore. Brazil, with a GDP of $2 trillion and 7.5% growth in 2010, is definitely arrived. A growing middle class, and with the World Cup coming and the Olympics, infrastructure projects will definitely continue that growth in the middle class. And of course, the recent major oil find will likely contribute even more to that phenomenon. One of the things that some of you may have noted, headline last week, McDonald's Corporation's biggest independent franchise operator, a company called Latam Arcos Dorados, which, by the way, Arcos Dorados is golden arches. Arcos Dorados did an IPO in New York at twice the valuation of McDonald's itself. And there's a good reason for that. Its growth rate from Brazil alone was 6 times the growth rate of McDonald's worldwide in 2010. It has been said that in Latin America, or Latin American democracy rather, faces 2 significant threats. The first is autocracy, and the second is incompetence. No more. If we look at Brazil, it has enjoyed now 16 years of highly competent democratic government, and all indications are Rousseff will continue that track record. I'd like to make a couple of comments or predictions regarding globalization. I would suspect, perhaps I'm less optimistic or less visionary. I'm sure I'm less visionary than Prime Minister Mulroney. I'm not sure I see a tip-to-toe free trade agreement anytime soon in Latin America, but I certainly would see an emergence of more, in general, bilateral BRIC agreements, but more expanded free trade areas in Latin America, and a possible formation of a customs union. And I also would not be surprised to see Brazil emerging as an informal leader of the continent. As an inveterate salesman, I have to say something about my area that I was chosen or assigned to represent today, Latin America, versus other areas that were chosen, so China and India. So I think the biggest advantage of Latin America is its sound, functioning, productive democracies. And is that 3 seconds? So I compare and contrast that to India, obviously a democracy, but my favorite tagline in India came from an Indian government official, thank you, who was quoted as saying that India grows at night when the government is sleeping. So that's my observation on India. On China, I have this perspective that the business world is a little bit enamored with the size of China's market, which is of course attractive, but sometimes I think the business world doesn't take into full consideration the risk of dealing with a totalitarian government. My observation is it is a totalitarian government coming under increasing internal pressure. For years, China has been destroying farmland to build factories. It is now a net importer of food. Commodities are rising in price. It's creating an inflation problem for the lower and middle class. And the inflation numbers are substantially higher than the reported numbers. And the government is, frankly, between a rock and a hard place, because the only way to solve that inflation problem is to allow the currency to rise in value, and doing that puts at risk its economic recovery. I, for one, think that in the long term, I frankly see as a possible scenario the demise of the Communist Party in China. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening in a benign way as it did in USSR.
Okay, thank you. I don't know about our timekeeper over there. We've, let's see, 4 or 5 minute talks have taken 35 minutes. Jorge, you might want to look at your quantitative studies curriculum here. But anyway.
It was fear.
Jorge has graciously said we now have 2 hours, so let's, no. Are there any comments people on the panel would make towards each other, or each other's comments, or exceptions, or reinforcements, or whatever? Hearing none, why don't we open it up for questions from the audience?
Sir, talking about the inflation problem in the developing countries, how does the inflation problem in BRIC countries will affect U.S.?
The inflation problem in which country or which area?
Who's it?
Brazil, Russia, India, China. BRIC countries.
BRIC countries. The inflation problem in the BRIC countries?
Oh, in the BRIC countries, okay. Principally, I guess, Brazil and China, I guess. I'm squirming.
Excellent question, yes.
Yeah, obviously.
No, as I understand, Brazil is facing a pretty substantial inflationary pressure. It's not surprising.
I would comment, my observation is Brazil's dealing with that problem fairly effectively. And the problem is in fact multifaceted. There's been an inflow of short-term capital, hot money, that so-called carry trade that has kind of exacerbated its problem as it's put upward pressure on the real, and which threatens to hurt Brazil's recovery, and yet at the same time then interest rates have to rise to kind of cool the inflationary environment. So Brazil has its tensions in that regard. But my perspective is they're handling those quite well. I don't know.
I'll just add a little bit from a business perspective, looking to do business in a country that is likely to face inflation. There's no magic to this answer. When we go into countries like that, we index our contracts so that the price rises with the indexes in that country, and then we make sure we do a very good job of, most of our contracts are multi-year because our projects are pretty large. We do a very good job of understanding when the cash flows take place, and we hedge. So index your, there's no magic inside that, but index your contracts and we make sure we hedge it out. That allows us to take the majority of that risk away as we move forward.
I guess the only comment I'll make is sometimes you have to keep an eye on, and I don't necessarily see it in the countries that you just mentioned, but in general, you'll see countries that do very stupid things in trying to deal with these sorts of issues, including putting up export bans on products that they consider to be sensitive to causing inflation, which then creates a disincentive for investment in an unstable investment environment. I've had clients that have had to do major problems with governments, whether you're talking about Argentina, Venezuela, other places where literally you wonder if the government understands the economics over the longer term, because these have serious implications and cause companies to face a different environment than what they anticipated when they came in with all the assurances that they thought that they were given. It's one of the things when you work in the developing world you have to be sensitive to is even, I mean, look at Venezuela. It was the beachhead of democracy for 30 years in Latin America, and now it's the worst example of a dictatorship under the guise of being a democracy. So when you're doing business in these places, don't take anything for granted. You need to really keep track of where the government's going, try to have influence on it, having local partners that can advocate for good policy can keep you maybe out of trouble.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Thank you. I'm a student in the School of Business. My question is that all the free trade agreements, the numbers are very good. There's a lot of business across these countries who make these agreements. However, there is a lot of job loss in US particularly because of jobs which have gone away to other countries. There are some jobs created, of course, but not in the same areas as the job loss has happened in manufacturing or in some other areas. So there is a political fallout of that. Now, what is the business going to do? Because it affects business too, if the free trade agreements are not made. What is the strategy or plan for business community to address this particular issue of job loss because of free trade agreements?
I doubt that the business community has a plan, but I'm sure there's some perspectives up here at the table.
I'll make a challenge just on the assumption that free trade agreements have created job loss. If you look particularly at the free trade agreements that are currently on the table and have been on the table since 2006, I believe, 7. Colombia was signed in November of 2006, right after the Democrats took control of the Congress. Then you would recognize that the countries we're talking about here in Latin America are all countries that currently benefit from preferential trade agreements. So the United States is a huge beneficiary. It's almost a one-sided deal where the United States is getting access to these markets that they haven't had access to, and in return these countries are getting assurances that the access they've always had is going to continue, which of course creates a better investment climate for people that want to invest. I've always found one of the ironies is that these preferences will pass the U.S. Congress by 95% vote margin, and it's a one-sided deal where a bilateral trade agreement that is both directions, and particularly to our benefit, we sometimes can't get through for 4 years. It's just mind-boggling to me. And one of the things when we were negotiating these free trade agreements, particularly when we were doing Central America, which only passed our Congress by 2 votes, all of the countries we dealt with had preferential agreement with the United States. So again, we weren't really giving away anything. The real issue to us was we were facing in the region, and the Prime Minister referred to this, we needed to create in the region a competitive regional environment that we could compete with the rest of the world. Because if we continued to be broken up into different pieces instead of taking advantage of the synergies we could create between our countries, we were going to have our lunch eaten by us in Asia and other places. So I think when you're looking at it from a business perspective, the more you can look at it as a region, the better. And actually, there was a comment that was made earlier regarding integration of the region, head to toe here. That to some extent you're seeing that, at least as a North American, you're seeing that. If you go down the whole western part of the continent, there's a free trade agreement basically everywhere from Alaska and Canada all the way down to the tip of Chile. On the eastern side of the continent, South America, that's not so true because the Mercosur countries really haven't participated in free trade. We haven't been able to get a free trade negotiation with any of those specific countries. But there's already regional integration taking place. As an American company, you can trade pretty barrier-free in a number of countries throughout the region. And I don't see it as a job loss. I see it as creating opportunities, frankly.
Anybody else on the panel want to?
I'll add just a little bit. It's all about the jobs, right? We hear that every day. It's absolutely true, not just here, it's true across the board. I would also push back and challenge a bit on the basic assumption that as we open the borders and we look to do more and more global trade, that there's really a job loss. I can tell you in our case, as we continue to look at opportunities around the globe and we continue to grow, the net impact is positive on the job front, both in the countries that we're moving into because of the local content that we always add, and it's also positive in the countries in which we're primarily based. So we've added several thousand jobs, mostly in the US, some in Europe, on top of the jobs we've added in the countries that we go into. That may be unique to our business, I don't know, but it's a conscious effort on our part to balance that out.
I'd offer a modification. Clearly, jobs are important. but I think one of the issues about the job thing is it oftentimes is a special interest kind of issue with a very loud voice. And the fact is, one of my favorite observations about globalization that I share with my students is that one of the issues is the principal beneficiary of the process of globalization is the consumer, who gets better price and better choice of products. And unfortunately, nobody walks down their stairs on Christmas morning, looks under the Christmas tree, and says, look at all of these goods. Thank God for globalization, or I wouldn't have this much under my Christmas tree. But the fact is, it's true.
Okay, thank you. I guess that stop means what I think it means. Okay.
Did I run over?
I've often wondered, because I remember going to Venezuela once before Chavez and being told the one thing you really need to remember is that mañana does not mean tomorrow. It means not today. And I thought, you know, that is, there's quite a difference. Let's thank our panel and our host.